Hi people, welcome back to my channel and to my series Mind and Soul, where I look at education through different perspectives. And speaking of looking at education, over the last few weeks, I've been asking myself, what am I really doing with this channel? Why is the material I'm covering here so different from what we covered when we were doing education as teachers in training? And then the second thing I ask myself is, why do Kenyans persist in contradictions? And actually, this Mind and Soul series is about trying to explain where the contradictions are. For example, we say that we want schooling to educate the whole human being, but then we ask later on, how is the school system preparing for the market? It's like we haven't quite decided whether we want our children to grow into whole human beings or into workers. The other contradiction I've noticed is we say that we don't want, we want the education system to, to not prepare people to look for jobs. But then when we are complaining about the education system, we go to the same employers whom we don't want our children to go to ask if the education system is working. So do we want schooling for employment or not? We need to answer that question for ourselves. And then linked to this, the third question I've been asking is, why is it that Kenyans cannot understand what I am saying? And in fact, if you look at the other series the other videos in this series, you will see that even after explaining what is wrong with some of these ideas we have, people still ask me in the comments, why don't we have, the very things I have been attacking? So, what is the link between these three questions? And I would say that what I am doing here is that I'm talking about the politics of education. And that's what this video is about. What is politics? And maybe we should start there because we can assume that we all know what politics is, and actually we don't. Politics has been defined by some people as a social decision-making process, meaning that it's about the decisions we make, all of us together. That's what politics is. Or my friend Lewis Gordon has also called politics answering the question, what shall we do? So politics involves a social process and all of us, and not just individuals. So if we define politics this way, politics is dependent on philosophy because philosophy asks the question, what matters to us? Because for us to decide the decisions to talk about the decisions we want to make, we have to ask what matters to us. Because what matters to us will affect the decisions we make. And we have to ask things like, is what matters to us humanity, or is what matters to us money and power? Now, you'll notice that these are two subjects, politics and philosophy, which are not taught in the education system. In fact, if you try to take those subjects, people will discourage you and tell you there's no market, especially philosophy. And there is a history of successive presidents. Like Moi used to say that we don't need politics and we don't need philosophy because it does not meet our market needs. And that is how departments of philosophy became tied to religion, and departments of political science started to be called government. And yet, what is interesting about it is that even in Britain, where this ideology of the market, education for the market came from, the ruling elite do a degree called PPE, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. So they are doing the subjects which they say that we should not do. So that is because the problems of our education system are right there at the politics and at the philosophy. What is the politics of our schooling system in Kenya? Now, I'm going to follow the chronology that was given by Kilemi Mweria, and I've posted a link to his video, to his article below this video. In this article, he explains that he reminds us that Kenya was initially created as a sphere of influence for the Imperial British East African Company, which was given the license to exploit the area between Zanzibar and Uganda. The thinking of that at that time was that Kenya was not valuable. What was valuable was Uganda. And so to exploit the resources of Uganda, there needed to be a railway that would take the goods to the coast and then back to Britain. So Kenya was a by the way. And then in 1895, the responsibility for Kenya transferred to the state, the British Empire, as a protectorate. And then, of course, in 1920, it became a colony. So basically, the role of the colonial state was to protect the market interests, the business interests of the people who were exploiting the resources of East Africa. That means that the kind of education system they set up was designed to protect this business, meaning that right from the very beginning, the language of training people for the market was started with the colonial roots of Kenya. So, in the design of the British Empire, Kenya was supposed to be a sphere of influence where the wealth was sustained by giving Europeans the power and the decision making, and the role of Africans was to provide labor. So Africans were not supposed to be part of the decision making about what happens in this land. And therefore, the school reflected that. The school was supposed to train a few who make the decisions and the many who provide those resources through their labor. That means, as Dr. Miria explains, that the education system was necessarily unequal. The kind of education Europeans were getting was not the kind of education that Asians would get and that Africans would get. And how did they create this inequality? They created it through a difference in the kind of resources that were given. So even though Europeans were 1% of the population and Africans were 97%, the bulk of the resources that the colonialists gave was to European education. So the schools like the Kenya Highs, the Lenanas, the Nairobi schools, which had different names then, they got the bulk of the resources because those schools were for Europeans. And then the African schools got very little resources by comparison. They also used exams so as to eliminate the number of Africans who could progress in the system. And this became even more necessary when Africans started to demand secondary school education, and later on they asked for university education. The other way in which the British maintained the inequality was through technical and religious instruction. So basically, the reason why the missionaries were so dominant in our education system was because the British government was basically saying, we don't want to bother with educating Africans. If you want to train them, fine. We might support you, but you, mjisot, find the resources. So the African schools were the most poorly resourced, and they were dominated by missionaries because the state was not committed to educating Africans. The technical education was designed to train Africans who would serve the system as clerks. So it's not for Africans to be decision makers about what they want with government or anything else. It was just so that Africans obey orders and do what they are told. So that is why education, technical and religious education were so important to the colonialists and to the settlers. That is the politics. But like I said, to justify that politics, you need a philosophy. So what philosophy did they use to justify this system? The first thing, of course, is a racial one. They said Europeans are superior, they can think better, and so they are the ones who can be able to cope with literal and humanities education because they have the more sophisticated minds. The other philosophy was that Africans are inferior. Their brains lack the capacity to think. So the only thing Africans are capable of is technical work with their hands. And so that is why they need technical education. And the other philosophy on Africans was that Africans are savages who needed to be saved. And so that is why they needed religious education to teach them morals and values. I hope you can see what I'm driving at as I mention these things. And another thing I need to mention about the role of missionaries and the church in education during colonial times was that for the church, their theology was directly linked to capitalism. What does that mean? It means that for the missionaries, the evidence of somebody being saved and being converted was not just that they believed that Jesus Christ is Lord and that they abandoned their African traditions. The other evidence was that they were part of the economy, meaning that they lived like Europeans, they were employed by Europeans. So basically, the church was converting people for capitalism, and I'll come back to that later. Now, this politics and philosophy of education did not change after independence. What we got with independence was not a change in our system, but in a change of the identity of the people who were running the system. So basically, colonialism was like a house, or I would say the government that we have was a house built by the British. The British lived in it. It was a house or a government designed for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. And then when we said they should get out, instead of dismantling the house, we let Africans move into the house. And even this state house, which the president now stays in, was built before independence. So all we did was that the president moved into the governor's house. And the British left a phone there to keep making calls to the residents of this house to keep telling them what to do. And that's the fast that we call independence. So education did not change fundamentally after we gained independence. Education became about training people to maintain the system. So when the independence government were talking of training manpower or nation building, they were talking not about us. They were not talking about we the people. They were talking about the government. They wanted to Africanize the government, and the way to do that was to take people to school. So for the first 10 or 15 years, the role of the school system was to train the Africans who could take over the operations of the colonial government that was now rebranded as independent. Now, there's a really good book by Mwenda Kithenji, and I'm going to share a link to the book below this video. And in this book, Mwenda Kithenji explains that Jomo Kenyatta, the first president, was content with the university training elites for government. And because those elites were mainly Kikuyu, it ended up that the government basically maintained Kikuyu dominance. And then when Moi came into power, he realized that to maintain power, you need an elite from your ethnic group. And that is why Moi expanded the university system to diversify the elite. So Moi, despite his flawed intentions, was the reason why the university education finally expanded to include more Kenyans from more places in Kenya. So, but now we have a different problem. You see, that time, many Africans were not educated. And so the political class was trying to boost the number of elites, African elites, who can run the colonial system. But now we are 60 years into independence. Those elites have gone. Their children are there and their grandchildren. And so there are already enough Nyeudis who can run this colonial system. And you can see that they're even employing their own children. The current president is a child of a former president. So the elites now feel that there are enough African elites and we don't need to get more Africans into school. So they are the Wazungu who are making us play the same role that we played under colonial rule. And that is why the politics and philosophy of our education system, even though it looks different, it's actually the same. Let me just give you some examples. The idea of using exams to weed out almost everybody so that you're left with only a few who proceed through the system is still there. And that's why we have a hashtag on Twitter, which is tyranny of 3PC, tyranny of the 3%. We started this hashtag inspired by someone, Johnson Nasimolo, who told us that the first thing they were told when they went to university, so we are talking about the other day, they were told that this system is for weeding out the majority of you and only a few of you will pass. And that logic is still maintained in the system. Remember, even when people were failed in KCSE about 3 or 4 years ago, what did we say? We said the 97% of Kenyans who failed KCSE, it was because they were cheats, they don't deserve, they are foolish. We said a lot of bad things about them. And we said that the fact that they had failed is evidence of the quality of our education system. So we still are operating on the colonial logic of having very few people go through the system. Another example is the emphasis on technical education, the TVET and the CBC. Remember, during colonial times, they were saying that Africans do not have the mental capacity to handle thinking. And that is why they must not do literal education. They must do only technical education to help them work. That is the same thing we are saying with TVET and CBC. We are saying we don't need theory, quote unquote, that we only need to train Kenyans to work with their hands. And that is why we don't need all these other subjects. We just need technical education. So nothing has changed. We are still saying the same thing. And what Kenyans are not realizing is that the elites are not giving their kids this TVET that we are talking about, or CBC. They're taking their kids to elite schools and expecting them to do the subjects which they're telling us ordinary Kenyans that we should not do. The other thing that is common today is the demand for values, and especially in Christian circles. And I'm going to put even homeschooling here because the focus of values is the same as before during colonial times. Remember, for the missionaries, they were giving us values, quote unquote, so that we become compliant and accept the current colonial system at the time. I mean, the colonial system at the time. And that's what people mean by values. When we are talking about values today, we are talking about how do we make Kenyans accept this system, not challenge it, and see it as a system ordained by God. So that is why you're seeing more and more churches being interested in education. But there's another unfortunate aspect of this idea of the church providing education. You see, the reason why, remember, during colonial times, the reason why the colonial government was content to leave schools to the churches and the missionaries, because they didn't want to invest in education. And that's the same thing that is happening now, because the government does not want to invest in the education of its people. It's telling the church to do it, and the church is only happy because then they can continue fronting their own agenda in Kenya. So the emphasis on churches providing education is about the government ceding ground and not wanting to provide education for us. But I also want to mention, and this is a sidebar, and I'm going to link you to an article I wrote about this. This is a failure of the church to move from the colonial theology. The church has not developed a theology of the public. What the church is trying to do by providing school is it has agreed to play the role of Caesar. So it is providing education instead of being the voice of the people and asking the government, where are our resources going? Because our children don't have education. That's what the church should be talking about. But instead, they are providing education and trying to be Caesar. And that's why they're always competing with government. And that's why you're even seeing pastors trying to look like CEOs or politicians, because they are competing with the government instead of doing their work to be on the side of the people. But that's a sidebar, and I'll put a link to a more sustained argument about that in the links below. So the other thing to remember about our current education system is that the role of the schooling institutions in Kenya is to maintain power. It's not to educate you. Schools in Kenya are more worried about their institutional survival than about you, the people who are coming to get educated. So, so of course they can't tell you that. So they'll tell you things like, or you'll get market skills, or you will have values, you'll come out this kind of person. But that's marketing, that's PR. Their job is to make you fit within the system that sustains them. Because if they train you to fit within that system that sustains them, in the few years down the road, you will also bring your children for the kind of education that you got. Now, this means that what is taught, how it is taught, and who teaches it are really not that important, because it doesn't change much if you haven't talked about the politics of the country, and then what kind of how is the education system supporting those politics. So when it comes to homeschooling, people keep asking me, what is wrong with homeschooling? Homeschooling is really inconsequential, in my opinion, because homeschooling is concerned about who is teaching rather than what kind of politics are we teaching for. So especially if the the homeschooling system is just teaching the curriculum that the other kids are learning, then that's a question of delivery. It's not a fundamental question of politics, and that has political implications down the road, which I will explain in another video. So I started this video by asking, what am I doing with this channel? What I'm trying to do with this channel is to explain how the schooling system we have reflects our politics and our philosophy. Our politics, as it now stands, is the colonial politics, which is having a few make decisions and control resources because they think they are better than us. And then the rest of us, all we do is to provide the labor to support that system. And this is the politics that is reflected not only in the schooling system, it's reflected in the media, it's reflected in the church, and of course, it's reflected in the government. That means that we need to understand politics and philosophy to understand our schooling system. And politics, as I said, isn't just about who is in office and who won elections. That's just a smaller part of politics. Politics in totality is how we make decisions together about all of us and the values that we use to make those decisions. That is what politics is. And so these questions we keep asking about what is in the curriculum, who is teaching, are they qualified, are schools inspected, really is inconsequential if we are not able to ask questions about politics and philosophy. What are the politics that guide us, and what is the philosophy that we use to guide us? So these questions about politics and philosophy are questions which are asked by adults. What I'm suggesting here is that what we face in Kenya is a lack of maturity. We are not asking the broader questions, we are stuck in unnecessary details, and we are unable to talk about what is it that we value and what do we do about it, which is what philosophy and politics are about. And why have I referred to this as a problem of maturity? That's what I'm going to address in the next episode of Mind and Soul. So until the next episode, remember, stories, stories, stories. We have to tell our stories and we need to listen to the stories of others. And it doesn't matter who they are, it doesn't matter who you are. All stories matter. And that's where actually the politics and the philosophy come from. So it's our inability to listen and to tell stories that makes us not be political or philosophical in the way that I'm talking about here. But see you in the next episode.